Thousands of years ago, before courts, police, or written governments existed, a single murder could ignite generations of revenge. Entire families lived trapped inside endless cycles of violence, fear, and survival. But somewhere beside the rivers of ancient Mesopotamia, humanity attempted something completely new. They carved rules into clay and stone, hoping laws could hold chaos back. Tonight, we journey into the birth of justice itself through the first cities, the first kings, brutal punishments, sacred oaths, and the ancient fear that civilization could collapse at any moment. Before we go deeper into humanity's first laws and the fight against chaos, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and settle in for this long journey into the ancient world. The man lies face down in the dust beside a narrow irrigation ditch, his blood already drying beneath the rising heat. Flies gather first, then silence. Beyond him, the fields continue to move in the wind as if nothing important has happened. Barley bends beneath the sun. Water slides slowly through hand-cut channels from a nearby river that floods unpredictably and without mercy. In the distance, smoke rises from mud brick homes pressed tightly together behind low walls. Someone will eventually carry news of the killing back into the settlement, and when they do, the dead man's relatives will begin counting names. Not witnesses, not evidence, names. Who struck him? Which family protected the killer? Who traded grain with them? Who once married into their bloodline? Who owes loyalty to whom? In the earliest human communities, before formal law exists, violence rarely ends with one body. Every injury carries memory behind it, and memory has weight. A stolen goat, a broken promise, a murdered brother, an insult spoken beside a fire decades earlier. Nothing disappears completely. The dead remain present through obligation. Revenge becomes inheritance. For thousands of years, this is how human order survives, not through courts or written rules, but through kinship, reputation, fear, and retaliation. Small groups remember everything because forgetting is dangerous. In isolated villages scattered across river valleys, forests, and dry grasslands, survival depends on belonging to people who will defend you when conflict comes. A lone individual is vulnerable, a family is protection, a clan is insurance against starvation, theft, and attack. But the same bonds that create safety also trap societies inside endless cycles of vengeance. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that prehistoric violence is neither constant nor rare. Human communities cooperate remarkably well, yet they also fracture with alarming speed. Ancient skeletons carry signs of healed fractures, crushed skulls, and embedded projectile points. Entire burial sites reveal massacres. At a location near the Nile Valley known as Jebel Sahaba, some of the dead still contain stone points lodged in their bones after more than 13,000 years. Scholars still debate whether this represents organized warfare or repeated raiding over generations, but the evidence remains unmistakable. Long before kingdoms rise, human beings already understand collective violence, and yet early communities cannot afford permanent chaos. The paradox appears almost immediately in human civilization. People need each other too much to live entirely through revenge. Cooperation feeds villages. Violence destroys them. Somewhere between these competing realities, the first unwritten laws begin to emerge. At first, these rules are simple and deeply personal. Elders remember precedents. Families negotiate compensation after injury. Rituals attempt to contain anger before it spreads. Among many ancient societies, Payment replaces retaliation under certain conditions. A death may demand livestock instead of another death. An injury may require grain, labor, or marriage alliances to repair damaged relationships. No central authority enforces these agreements. They survive because communities fear what happens when they fail. The fear is not abstract. In small settlements, a feud can poison every aspect of survival. Irrigation ditches are sabotaged in the night. Harvests disappear. Herd animals are killed. Children inherit grudges before they understand their origins. A cycle of revenge can fracture entire villages into hostile factions incapable of working together during floods or droughts. The first laws are born less from idealism than exhaustion. Endless vengeance consumes too much energy. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The oldest human settlements are fragile things. Mud walls melt in rain, timber rots, crops fail suddenly. Disease spreads quickly where animals and humans live too closely together. Even successful villages remain only one bad season away from collapse. Archaeology often reveals layers of abandonment beneath later rebuilding, as though early civilization repeatedly loses its grip before recovering again. In such conditions, stability becomes more valuable than freedom. This is especially true once populations begin growing beyond the size where everyone knows each other personally. In tiny hunter-gatherer bands, social pressure alone can often regulate behavior. Reputation travels instantly. Cooperation is visible. Resources are shared directly. But agriculture changes the scale of human life forever. As farming spreads across fertile river valleys after the end of the last ice age, permanent settlements become larger and denser. Grain can be stored. Surpluses can be accumulated. Wealth can finally remain in one place long enough to create inequality. Some families gain more land, more livestock, more influence. Others fall into debt. Strangers begin living beside one another without shared ancestry. Disputes become harder to settle through memory alone. The evidence from early agricultural societies reveals increasing social complexity almost everywhere farming takes hold. In the Fertile Crescent, villages evolve into proto-cities connected through trade and irrigation systems that require coordinated labor. In the Indus Valley, carefully planned urban settlements appear with drainage systems and standardized weights. Along the Nile, centralized authority slowly emerges beside predictable floods that feed enormous populations. Different regions develop differently, but the same underlying pressure appears repeatedly. Larger societies require stronger mechanisms of order. At first, authority often remains informal. Respected elders mediate disputes. Religious figures oversee rituals that reinforce cooperation. Assemblies gather to settle conflicts publicly. But these systems depend heavily on personal trust and local tradition. They struggle once societies become too large, too unequal, or too interconnected. The deeper problem is memory itself. Human memory is unstable. Witnesses disagree. Stories change with retelling. Families reshape events in their own favor. Without written records, justice depends largely on persuasion, status, and collective pressure. Powerful individuals can manipulate outcomes. Weak individuals can disappear into silence. No single explanation fully accounts for how early societies managed these tensions, because the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives suggests that ancient people recognized the danger quickly. Somewhere in the growing cities of early Mesopotamia, perhaps beside crowded marketplaces filled with donkeys, fish sellers, brewers, and laborers carrying mud bricks beneath brutal heat, rulers begin searching for something more durable than memory. They need systems that outlive individuals, rules that can survive after witnesses die, punishments that appear predictable instead of personal. They need ways to control strangers who share no blood ties at all. And beneath all of it lies a deeper fear that never fully disappears. Human beings understand chaos intimately because they live beside it every day. Rivers flood without warning, crops fail, storms flatten homes, disease kills children overnight, raiders emerge from distant horizons, kings fall, temples burn. The line between order and collapse is painfully thin in the ancient world. Early laws do not emerge in peaceful societies seeking perfection. They emerge in unstable societies terrified of disintegration. The first great legal systems are not simply about morality. They are survival technologies. Long before law becomes philosophy, it is defense against ruin. The rivers make civilization possible, and the rivers make civilization dangerous. In southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates spread across wide plains before emptying into the Persian Gulf, the landscape appears deceptively generous at first glance. Thick reeds crowd the marshes. Fish fill the waterways. Floods leave behind fertile soil capable of producing enormous harvests beneath the burning sun. But the rivers are unpredictable. Too little flooding brings drought and hunger. Too much destroys fields, homes, and canals in a matter of hours. Entire settlements depend on fragile systems of irrigation cut by human hands into unstable earth. If those systems fail, thousands starve. The earliest cities rise here anyway. By roughly the 4th millennium BCE, places like Uruk begin swelling into something humanity has never seen before. Dense populations gather behind walls of mud brick. Temples tower above crowded streets. Warehouses store grain collected from surrounding farmland. Boats move through canals carrying timber, copper, stone, textiles, and food between settlements separated by long distances. The world is becoming interconnected for the first time on a scale large enough to overwhelm older forms of social order. A village feud is one thing, a city of tens of thousands is something else entirely. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that Uruk grows with astonishing speed. Some scholars estimate its population may have reached 40,000 people or more at its height, an almost unimaginable concentration for the ancient world. The city spreads outward across the plain, consuming labour, water, and resources. Monumental temples rise through coordinated effort requiring administrators, planners, and systems of distribution. Workers must be fed. Canals must be maintained constantly against silt and collapse. Trade caravans need protection. Property disputes multiply as wealth accumulates unevenly. And everywhere, strangers appear. This changes human psychology as much as human politics. In small kin-based communities, trust emerges naturally through familiarity. But cities force people into daily contact with individuals they do not know and may never see again. Merchants arrive speaking foreign languages. Labourers migrate for work. Debtors seek loans from wealthy households or temple institutions. Servants move between districts. People begin interacting through transactions rather than personal relationships alone. The old systems of memory and clan obligation cannot fully manage this new world. Archaeologists excavating Mesopotamian sites repeatedly uncover evidence of expanding bureaucracy alongside urban growth. Clay tokens evolve into accounting systems. Cylinder seals identify ownership and authority. Administrative tablets record deliveries of grain, beer, livestock, and labour. These may seem mundane compared to later monuments or kings, but they reveal something fundamental. Civilization is becoming too complicated to function without organized records. The pressure is constant because Mesopotamian cities exist in competition with one another almost from the beginning. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, Nippur. Each city depends on surrounding agricultural land and control over irrigation systems. Water itself becomes political. A damaged canal can destroy harvest downstream. Boundaries between fields matter intensely because survival depends on measured access to fertile land. Scholars still debate how frequently warfare occurs during these early centuries, but fortified walls, weapons, and inscriptions celebrating victory suggest violence remains close beneath the surface. The first cities are engines of wealth and anxiety at the same time. Inside them, inequality grows visibly. Large elite residences stand beside cramped worker housing. Temple institutions accumulate enormous influence because they organize labor, manage food storage, and mediate between human society and unpredictable gods. Priests oversee rituals meant to secure divine favor for harvests and floods. Rulers emerge gradually from military leadership, religious authority, or both. Power concentrates because dispersed authority struggles to coordinate large populations during crisis. Yet even kings face limitations. No ruler can personally oversee every conflict inside a growing city. Theft, debt disputes, inheritance claims, accusations of fraud, violence between neighbors, disagreements over irrigation boundaries, unpaid labor obligations, broken trade contracts. The complexity multiplies faster than any individual memory can contain. Some mechanism must standardize expectations across entire populations. This is where law begins changing from custom into institution. The evidence survives in fragments scattered across clay tablets hardened accidentally in ancient fires. Administrative texts reveal attempts to regulate labor and distribution. Early legal judgments hint at evolving concepts of responsibility and compensation. What emerges slowly is not equality before the law in any modern sense, but predictability. Predictability matters enormously in unstable societies. A farmer planting crops beside an irrigation canal needs some confidence that his neighbors cannot simply divert the water without consequence. A merchant lending silver needs assurance that agreements will be recognized beyond personal trust. Temple authorities collecting grain taxes require systems capable of tracking obligations accurately. Cities cannot function at large scale if every dispute escalates into private retaliation. The rivers themselves intensify this need for coordination. Irrigation agriculture demands collective labor on massive projects. Canals must be dug, widened, repaired, and cleared continuously. Levees require maintenance before flood seasons arrive. Reservoirs and drainage systems depend on synchronized effort involving thousands of people. One neglected section of canal can damage entire regions downstream. Cooperation becomes survival infrastructure. But cooperation in unequal societies rarely happens voluntarily forever. Someone must organize labor. Someone must settle disputes over resources. Someone must punish sabotage, theft, or refusal to participate. The earlier states emerge partly because environmental management becomes too large for loose tribal systems alone. Mesopotamian myths preserve echoes of this struggle in symbolic form. Ancient stories describe humanity created to labor for the gods, cities established through divine order, and kings appointed to maintain stability against ever-present chaos. Flood narratives appear repeatedly across the region, reflecting both real environmental danger and deeper cultural fears about civilization collapsing back into disorder. To the people living there, chaos is not metaphorical. It surrounds them physically. Even the architecture reflects this anxiety. City walls grow thicker, temples rise higher, storage facilities expand, bureaucracies multiply. Everything about early urban civilization suggests societies attempting to hold fragile systems together against constant pressure from nature, rivals, and human ambition itself. And beneath these systems, another transformation is taking shape quietly inside administrative rooms lined with clay tablets. Writing. At first, writing in Mesopotamia is practical rather than literary. Early symbols track commodities, labor obligations, and trade goods. But once words can be fixed permanently into clay, human authority changes forever. Spoken agreements fade. Written records endure. A ruler's commands can now travel beyond immediate presence. Debts survive memory. Ownership becomes documented. Judgments can be referenced long after witnesses die. No single invention alters the future of law more profoundly. The first legal systems are still crude by later standards. Punishments vary according to status. Corruption remains common. Enforcement depends heavily on local power structures, yet something irreversible has begun. Human societies are slowly moving away from justice rooted entirely in personal vengeance and towards systems claiming broader authority. The transition is incomplete and often brutal. Violence does not disappear inside cities. In many ways, it becomes more organized. Armies expand. Forced labor increases. Harsh punishments intimidate populations. The same states that create laws also wage wars and extract taxes relentlessly. Still, beneath the dust of Mesopotamia, among canals that flood unpredictably beneath merciless skies, humanity begins constructing a new idea. That order can be written. That power can become permanent. That chaos itself might be restrained by symbols pressed into wet clay before the tablets harden beneath the sun. The king stands between civilization and disaster. At least, that is what the inscriptions claim. In the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, authority does not present itself merely as political power. It presents itself as necessity woven into the structure of the universe itself. Floodwaters rise and fall according to divine will. Harvests depend on sacred favor. Armies succeed because the gods permit victory. Disease, famine, rebellion, eclipse, drought, and invasion all carry supernatural meaning in societies where nature feels terrifyingly alive. A ruler who cannot maintain order risks more than public anger. He risks cosmic imbalance. This belief changes the meaning of law completely. The earliest kings do not describe themselves primarily as lawmakers in the modern sense. They portray themselves as restorers of balance. Their inscriptions speak constantly of justice, but justice in the ancient world often means something broader and harsher than fairness between equals. It means stabilizing society so the strong do not devour the weak openly enough to destroy the state itself. It means securing irrigation canals, protecting trade routes, maintaining temple rituals, suppressing rebellion, and ensuring grain reaches storage facilities before famine arrives. The king becomes the living barrier against collapse. What survives in the historical record suggests that early Mesopotamian rulership develops gradually from overlapping forms of authority. Some leaders emerge from military command during crises. Others grow powerful through temple administration or control of agricultural labor. Over time, these roles merge. Kingship absorbs religious symbolism because raw force alone rarely sustains obedience for long. Armies can conquer cities, but myths justify why people should continue obeying afterward. And the myths are powerful. Mesopotamian rulers often describe themselves as chosen by the gods to shepherd humanity through a dangerous world. Inscriptions carved into stone or pressed into clay portray kings receiving authority directly from divine beings. The language is deliberate. A ruler is not simply stronger than ordinary people. He is necessary to the survival of order itself. This idea appears repeatedly across ancient civilizations. In Egypt, the pharaoh embodies divine harmony known as Ma'at, the cosmic principle balancing truth, justice, and stability against chaos. Along the Nile, where predictable flooding sustains enormous populations, centralized authority becomes inseparable from sacred order. The king performs rituals believed essential to maintaining the proper functioning of the universe. Political rebellion is therefore more than disobedience. It threatens creation itself. Similar patterns emerge elsewhere. Early Chinese political philosophy later develops the mandate of heaven, linking legitimate rule to cosmic balance and moral order. Across ancient societies, rulers repeatedly claim that without strong centralized authority, humanity slides backward into violence, famine, and fragmentation. The fear is not entirely invented. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian city-states compete fiercely over land, trade, and water. Archaeological evidence reveals repeated warfare between neighbouring powers. Defensive walls expand. Royal inscriptions celebrate military victories with grim pride. Captives are enslaved. Fields are burned. Canals are destroyed deliberately to cripple rivals. Some cities rise rapidly and vanish just as quickly beneath conquest or environmental decline. To ordinary people living through these cycles, instability is immediate and personal. A weak ruler may mean raiders entering the countryside. Irrigation systems may fall into disrepair. Trade may collapse. Grain prices may spiral during drought. Lawlessness is not philosophical. It threatens survival directly. Kings exploit this fear carefully. One of the earliest rulers associated with significant legal reform is Urukagina of Lagash, who reigned sometime in the 24th century BCE. The surviving evidence remains fragmentary, and scholars still debate the exact nature of his reforms. But inscriptions suggest attempts to curb abuses by powerful officials and temple authorities. He presents himself as a protector of widows, orphans, and vulnerable citizens against corruption. Whether these reforms transform daily life substantially remains uncertain. Ancient rulers often exaggerate their virtue. Still, the language itself matters enormously. For perhaps the first time, political authority publicly claims responsibility for regulating injustice beyond immediate royal interests. Soon afterward, another ruler pushes the idea further. Ur-Nammu, king of Ur around the 21st century BCE, oversees one of the earliest surviving law codes known to history. Unlike later rulers who emphasize terror and divine punishment more heavily, Ur-Nammu's surviving laws often focus on compensation rather than automatic physical retaliation. Fines are imposed for certain injuries. Monetary payments settle disputes that might previously have triggered blood feuds. The system remains deeply unequal by modern standards, but it reflects an important shift. The state increasingly inserts itself between private violence and social order. What survives in the record suggests these kings understand something fundamental about power. Endless revenge weakens centralized authority because private feuds compete with state control. A ruler seeking stable taxation, reliable labor, and military strength cannot allow every dispute to spiral indefinitely between families and clans. Law becomes a method of monopolizing violence gradually. Only the state, ideally, should decide legitimate punishment. But the reality remains far messier than royal inscriptions suggest. ancient states possess limited administrative reach. Communication is slow. Local elites retain enormous influence. Corruption persists everywhere. In many regions, practical justice still depends heavily on wealth, social status, and personal connections. The image of the king as universal guardian often exceeds what governments can actually enforce. Even so, symbols matter. Royal monuments depicting divine approval reinforce authority psychologically across populations who may never meet their rulers directly. Temples display inscriptions proclaiming justice restored by sacred kings. Ceremonies dramatize the ruler's relationship with supernatural powers. Public architecture itself becomes propaganda. Massive ziggurats rising above Mesopotamian cities communicate stability through sheer scale. They suggest permanence in landscapes where floods and wars erase ordinary lives constantly. Law and religion fuse together because separating them would seem almost impossible in the ancient world. Natural disasters appear morally significant. Military defeats imply divine anger. Successful harvests confirm proper ritual order. Under such conditions, kingship becomes part priesthood, part military command, part bureaucracy. And always, beneath the sacred imagery lies force. No ancient legal system survives through belief alone. Armies enforce taxation. Officials oversee labor obligations. Punishments intimidate dissenters publicly. Some rulers govern through remarkable administrative sophistication, while others rely more openly on terror. The line between lawful authority and organized coercion often blurs completely. The Assyrians later become infamous for this strategy. Royal inscriptions describe brutal punishments inflicted upon rebellious cities in horrifying detail. Severed heads, impalement, mass deportations. Violence becomes theatre designed to prevent future resistance through fear. Scholars debate how literally every inscription should be interpreted, since royal propaganda often exaggerates cruelty for political effect. But the underlying message remains unmistakable. Order depends on demonstrating the catastrophic consequences of rebellion. And yet even the harshest rulers continue framing their actions as defenses against chaos. This reveals one of the deepest paradoxes at the heart of early law. Civilization condemns violence while depending upon it constantly. States emerge partly to reduce endless private revenge, yet they also centralize the right to punish, imprison, torture, and execute. Ancient kings promise stability, but often achieve it through overwhelming force backed by sacred legitimacy. Still, many ordinary people likely prefer predictable authority to permanent disorder. The evidence remains incomplete because the voices of common labourers, farmers, servants, and enslaved individuals survive only faintly beside royal monuments. But stable irrigation, functioning trade networks, and reduced clan warfare offer real advantages in dangerous environments. The first great legal systems are therefore neither purely noble nor purely oppressive. They are survival mechanisms created by frightened civilizations trying desperately to hold themselves together. And soon, those civilizations will discover a new and revolutionary possibility. That law can be preserved not only in memory or royal proclamation, but in writing durable enough to outlive kings themselves. The tablet is small enough to fit inside a human hand. Its surface appears unimpressive at first glance, hardened clay. Faint wedge-shaped marks pressed carefully into wet earth thousands of years ago by a reed stylus. No gold, no statues, no grand monument towering above desert sands. Yet objects like this alter human civilization more profoundly than most empires ever will. Because memory is fragile. A spoken judgment disappears the moment breath leaves the mouth. Witnesses forget. Elders die. Stories bend slowly with each retelling until certainty dissolves into argument. For most of human history, this instability defines justice itself. What people remember becomes truth. What powerful people insist happened becomes truth even faster. Writing changes that balance forever. The earliest writing systems emerge gradually from accounting and administration rather than literature or philosophy. In Mesopotamia, long before epic poems are recorded, temple officials and merchants are already tracking grain deliveries, livestock counts, labor obligations, and trade goods. Archaeologists uncover clay tokens used to represent commodities, sealed inside clay envelopes that preserve transaction records physically, over generations. The symbols become increasingly abstract and efficient until they evolve into cuneiform writing. Civilization begins with bookkeeping. It is one of history's quieter ironies. Humanity often imagines writing born from artistic inspiration or sacred revelation. But the earliest surviving texts are overwhelmingly practical. Lists, inventories, tax records, ration distributions, property accounts. The machinery of organized society leaves deeper marks than poetry at first. Yet once symbols can reliably preserve information outside the human brain, the consequences spread rapidly beyond economics. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that writing quickly becomes a tool of political authority. Kings issue decrees, temples track obligations, administrators monitor labor, contracts establish ownership. Disputes can now reference permanent records rather than competing memories alone. The state gains as new kind of power continuity across time. A ruler no longer needs to stand physically before every subject to enforce authority. Written orders travel independently. Debts survive the death of witnesses. Legal precedents accumulate. Bureaucracies expand because information itself becomes storable and transferable. This transformation is difficult to overstate. Before writing, most human societies operate within the limits of living memory. Complex administration becomes extremely difficult beyond a certain scale because every obligation, agreement, and inheritance claim depends on oral transmission. Writing externalizes memory. Civilization can suddenly grow larger, more interconnected, and more permanent because information no longer vanishes automatically with each generation. The cities of Mesopotamia become archives of human obligation. Inside temple complexes and administrative buildings, scribes sit for long hours shaping signs into wet clay beneath dim light and oppressive heat. They belong to a specialized class requiring years of training. Literacy remains rare and prestigious. Most people cannot read the records governing aspects of their lives. This imbalance matters enormously. Written law may appear more stable than oral tradition, but it also concentrates power among those who control interpretation. Scribes become guardians of civilization's memory. Their work is exhausting and precise. Thousands of cuneiform signs must be mastered. Mistakes can alter property agreements, tax obligations, or legal judgments. Tablets are dried beneath the sun or baked accidentally in fires that later preserve them for archaeologists millennia afterward. Entire rooms fill with records documenting grain shipments, land boundaries, marriages, debts, labor assignments, and court decisions. What emerges is not simply writing, but institutional memory. For the first time, governments can compare present disputes against older precedents. Contracts become more standardized. Commercial relationships extend farther across regions because agreements leave physical evidence behind. Merchants trading over long distances gain new forms of trust rooted not entirely in personal familiarity, but in documented obligation. and law begins shifting subtly from personal negotiation toward abstract system. This shift happens unevenly. Oral tradition remains enormously important for centuries, especially outside major urban centers. Many disputes still rely on local custom and community mediation. The evidence remains incomplete regarding how consistently written law shapes ordinary daily life during these early periods. Scholars caution against imagining ancient societies as fully bureaucratic in the modern sense. Still, the direction is unmistakable. Writing allows rulers to claim permanence in ways earlier societies cannot. A spoken order fades. A carved inscription endures publicly. Kings begin commemorating victories, building projects, religious devotion, and legal reforms in durable materials meant to outlast their own lifetimes. Authority becomes historical. This creates a new relationship between power and truth. Once laws are written down, they appear less negotiable, even when enforcement remains inconsistent. The existence of a fixed text suggests stability and legitimacy beyond individual whim. Whether rulers always obey their own laws is another matter entirely. Ancient governments often violate proclaimed ideals openly when politically convenient. Yet written codes still matter because they establish expectations that survive particular moments. The symbolism becomes especially powerful when laws are displayed publicly. In later centuries, monumental inscriptions present legal authority almost like sacred revelation descending into human society. But even before famous law codes appear, smaller administrative tablets already reshape civilization quietly from within. They create networks of accountability extending beyond personal relationships. A farmer may dispute a boundary using recorded agreements. A merchant may reference a contract signed months earlier. A temple official may calculate grain taxes across multiple harvest seasons with unprecedented accuracy. The world becomes measurable. This development carries darker consequences too. Written records make taxation more efficient. Labor obligations become easier to enforce systematically. States can track populations, debts, and resources with growing precision. Individuals become legible to institutions in new ways. A peasant owing grain to temple authorities cannot easily erase the obligation once it exists in clay records stored inside administrative archives. Civilization gains memory, but memory can imprison as well as protect. The surviving tablets reveal astonishing details about ancient lives. Marriage contracts specify dowries and inheritance terms. Adoption agreements preserve family arrangements. Debt records expose economic pressures trapping vulnerable households. Court cases describe disputes over slaves, fields, livestock, and broken promises. Beneath the formal language, fragments of ordinary human anxiety remain visible across thousands of years. A man borrows silver and cannot repay it. A family argues over inheritance rights. A worker accuses another of theft. A widow seeks protection for her children. The ancient world becomes unexpectedly recognizable through its paperwork. At the same time, the surviving evidence reminds us how unequal these societies remain. Literacy belongs mostly to elites. Women often face severe legal disadvantages. Enslaved people appear frequently as property within records rather than as voices. Punishments vary according to social rank. Justice exists, but rarely as equality. No single explanation fully accounts for why written law spread so successfully across early civilizations, but part of the answer may lie in psychological reassurance. In dangerous and rapidly growing societies, permanence itself feels comforting. Written rules imply predictability. Predictability reduces fear. The irony, of course, is that the earliest written laws emerge in civilizations already haunted by instability. Floods still destroy cities, armies still invade, Dynasties still collapse, drought still brings famine, writing cannot eliminate chaos, but it offers something ancient rulers and ordinary people alike desperately crave: the possibility that order might survive human forgetfulness. And soon, in the city of Ur, a king named Ur-Nammu will attempt something even more ambitious. He will not merely record transactions or judgments. He will try to write justice itself. The code survives only in fragments. Broken tablets, missing lines, sentences interrupted by cracks running through ancient clay-like dried riverbeds. Entire sections vanished into dust long before archaeologists uncover what remains beneath Mesopotamian ruins. Yet even in pieces, the voice emerging from these tablets feels startlingly confident. A king speaks across 4,000 years and declares that chaos must be restrained. His name is Ur-Nammu. Around the 21st century BCE, after periods of political fragmentation and conflict across Mesopotamia, the city of Ur rises again beneath the rule of the third dynasty of Ur. Massive construction projects reshape the landscape. Temples are restored. Administrative systems expand. Trade networks reconnect regions damaged by war and instability. The dynasty presents itself as a force of renewal after disorder, and at the center of that message stands the idea of lawful rule. What survives of Ur-Nammu's law code may represent the oldest substantial legal code yet discovered. The surviving text begins not with punishment, but legitimacy. Like many ancient rulers, Ur-Nammu frames his authority as divinely sanctioned. The gods have chosen him to establish justice and eliminate corruption. Widows and orphans receive special mention, not necessarily because ancient society suddenly becomes compassionate by modern standards, but because protecting vulnerable populations helps reinforce the image of the king as guardian of social stability. The language matters. Early law is never merely procedural, it is moral theatre. Ancient rulers understand that power alone does not create durable obedience. People must believe the system serves some larger order beyond brute force. Even when governments remain unequal or harsh, they justify themselves by claiming to restrain greater dangers: vengeance, theft, exploitation, famine, rebellion, disorder. Ur-Nammu's code reveals a society trying to regulate violence before it spirals beyond control. Some laws concern bodily injury, others regulate marriage, slavery, property disputes, false accusations, or sexual conduct. Much of the code survives only partially, and scholars still debate aspects of translation and interpretation, but one feature stands out clearly. Compared to many later Mesopotamian laws, the punishments in Ur-Nammu's code often rely on financial compensation rather than immediate physical retaliation. If a man knocks out another man's eye, silver may be paid. If a tooth is broken, compensation follows. If an injury occurs, measured penalties attempt to replace escalating revenge. This does not mean the society is gentle. Far from it. Severe punishments still exist for major crimes, including execution in some cases. Slavery remains deeply embedded within the economy. Social rank continues determining legal outcomes heavily. Women possess limited rights compared to men in many areas of life. Yet the code still reflects an important transition in human thinking. The state increasingly claims authority over conflict resolution. Instead of allowing families to pursue unlimited vengeance, legal systems begin assigning standardized consequences. The exact amounts and penalties vary according to status and circumstance, but the principle matters enormously. Violence becomes regulated through institutional judgment rather than personal retaliation alone. No single explanation fully accounts for why compensation-based justice emerges so strongly in some early societies. but practical survival likely plays a major role. Endless blood feuds destabilize agriculture, trade, and governance. In crowded urban civilizations dependent on cooperation, reducing cycles of revenge becomes economically valuable. The law code therefore functions partly as social engineering. A damaged body becomes quantifiable. Harm receives measured value in silver or punishment determined by authorities rather than emotional retaliation. Human suffering enters systems of calculation. Modern readers may find this unsettling, yet in its own context it represents an attempt to contain chaos through predictability. The city of itself reflects this broader ambition toward organized stability. Archaeological excavations reveal planned streets, administrative districts, temples, workshops, and enormous storage facilities connected through bureaucratic oversight. The famous Great Ziggurat of rises above the city as both religious monument and political symbol, visible across the surrounding plains. Monumental architecture communicates permanence in a world where instability remains constant. And instability never truly disappears. Mesopotamia during this period remains vulnerable to invasion, environmental pressure, internal rebellion, and shifting trade networks. Agricultural systems depend on careful irrigation management. Salinization gradually damages farmland in some regions as mineral buildup weakens crop yields over generations. Rival states continue competing violently for territory and resources. Even powerful dynasties exist under constant threat. Law emerges not in peaceful conditions, but under pressure. The surviving tablets from also reveal the immense complexity of daily administration required to sustain early states. Bureaucrats track labor assignments meticulously. Workers receive measured rations of grain and beer. Officials record livestock numbers, tax obligations, and land distribution. The machinery of governance extends deeply into ordinary life. This creates a strange duality at the heart of civilization. The same systems that protect stability also increase institutional control over individuals. Law can shield vulnerable people from arbitrary violence, yet it can also bind populations into rigid hierarchies enforced through bureaucracy and punishment. Ancient states promise order, but they demand obedience in return. For many people, that exchange may still feel preferable to the alternatives. What survives in the historical record suggests that ordinary life in ancient cities carries constant uncertainty. Drought can trigger famine rapidly. Disease spreads through dense populations. Debt traps vulnerable families. Warfare interrupts trade and agriculture alike. Under such conditions, even imperfect legal systems offer something precious: expectations. A merchant can risk long-distance trade if contracts hold some recognized authority. A farmer can plant crops with greater confidence if property boundaries remain enforceable. A widow may appeal to legal protections instead of relying entirely upon male relatives. These protections remain limited and uneven, but they matter nonetheless. Scholars still debate how consistently ancient laws were enforced in practice. Legal codes may function partly as royal propaganda rather than exhaustive descriptions of daily judicial reality. Some punishments written into law codes may rarely have been applied literally. Local custom and negotiation likely continued shaping many disputes behind the scenes. The evidence remains incomplete because surviving records disproportionately preserve elite perspectives. Still, the symbolic importance of written law keeps growing. Once rulers begin presenting justice as something permanent, measurable, and publicly proclaimed, legal authority acquires new legitimacy independent of any single ruler's personality. The idea itself survives dynasties. And future kings will expand that idea dramatically. Within a few centuries, another Mesopotamian ruler will commission one of the most famous monuments in human history. His law code will be carved not onto fragile tablets hidden inside archives, but onto towering black stone meant for public display. Its message will be unmistakable. Civilization will survive through fear, hierarchy, and obedience. Or it will not survive at all. The stone rises taller than a man. Dark basalt polished smooth beneath the Mesopotamian sun. At its summit, a king stands before a seated god, one human figure receiving authority from another who belongs to the heavens. Below them, columns of tightly carved cuneiform spread downward across the monument like an unbroken wall of command, hundreds of laws, punishments, judgments, social distinctions, warnings. The message is meant to endure. Nearly 4,000 years later, the Code of Hammurabi remains one of the most recognizable legal monuments in human history, not because it creates the first laws, but because it transforms law into spectacle. Earlier rulers record legal principles on clay tablets stored in archives. Hammurabi places authority into stone. Permanent, public, immovable, or at least intended to appear that way. Hammurabi rules Babylon during the 18th century BCE, a period when Mesopotamia remains fractured among competing kingdoms struggling for dominance. Through military campaigns, alliances, and political maneuvering, he gradually expands Babylonian power across much of the region. By the end of his reign, Babylon controls an enormous territory connected by trade routes, agricultural networks, and administrative systems requiring stronger centralized authority than ever before. Empires create legal problems smaller kingdoms can often avoid. Different cities possess different customs, languages vary, local traditions conflict. Merchants travel farther distances carrying goods between populations who share neither ancestry nor local loyalties. Taxation grows more complicated. Corruption spreads through expanding bureaucracies. Provincial governors gain opportunities to abuse power, and everywhere, disputes multiply. Hammurabi responds not only with armies, but with legal standardization. The famous stele discovered centuries later at Susa contains nearly 300 laws covering astonishingly diverse aspects of life: property rights, marriage, inheritance, debt, assault, trade, agriculture, construction liability, slavery, wages, theft, false accusations, harboring fugitives, negligence. Even the responsibility of tavern keepers appears within the text. Civilization is becoming administratively dense. The laws themselves are often brutally direct. If a builder constructs a house poorly and it collapses, killing the owner, the builder may be executed. If a surgeon causes death during an operation, his hands may be cut off. False witnesses can receive the punishment intended for the accused. Thieves may face death. Adulterous partners may be drowned. Modern readers often focus immediately on the harshness. And the harshness is real. The code openly embraces severe corporal punishment and execution as tools of social control. Violence stands at the center of authority. But beneath the brutality lies another principle equally important to the ancient state: predictability. Hammurabi's laws attempt to define consequences systematically across a vast and unequal society. This predictability serves political purposes. An empire cannot function efficiently if every dispute depends entirely on local improvisation or personal vengeance. Merchants need recognizable standards. Officials require procedures. Property claims must remain enforceable beyond individual memory. The code helps create administrative cohesion across culturally diverse territories. At the same time, the laws reveal a society obsessed with hierarchy. Not all lives possess equal value under Babylonian law. Punishments vary sharply according to social class. Injuring a nobleman may trigger harsher penalties than harming a common labourer. Enslaved individuals receive radically different legal treatment than free citizens. Women's rights exist within tightly controlled patriarchal structures, emphasizing male authority over households and inheritance. The famous principle, often summarized as an eye for an eye, reflects this hierarchical logic more than modern ideas of equality. Retribution is calibrated according to status. The goal is not universal fairness, but structured social balance. What survives in the record suggests that ancient Babylonians likely understand this clearly. Society is imagined not as a collection of equal individuals, but as an ordered hierarchy where each group possesses defined obligations and protections. Law stabilizes these relationships by making boundaries explicit. The monument itself reinforces this worldview visually. At the top of the stele, Hammurabi receives symbols of authority from the sun god Shamash, associated with justice. The imagery matters profoundly. The king does not present the laws as personal inventions alone. They descend from divine order. To disobey them is therefore not merely political rebellion. It risks violating sacred structure woven into the cosmos itself. Religion and law become inseparable. This fusion gives legal authority enormous psychological power in societies where divine forces are believed to shape every aspect of existence. Floods, droughts, disease, military defeat, and social unrest all carry spiritual significance. A lawful society is not simply organized, it is morally aligned with the universe. And yet the reality beneath the ideology remains unstable. Scholars still debate how extensively Hammurabi's code was applied in daily judicial practice. The monument may function partly as royal propaganda rather than a literal legal manual consulted constantly by judges. Local courts likely continue relying heavily on precedent, custom, and negotiation. Some punishments described in the code may rarely have been enforced exactly as written. But even if imperfectly applied, the code changes something fundamental. Law now exists publicly above individual disputes. A person standing before the great stele in Babylon sees authority transformed into visible permanence. The state claims to regulate life comprehensively. Human behavior becomes categorized, measured, and judged through written principles extending across an empire. This has emotional consequences as well as political ones. Fear becomes institutionalized. The punishments described in the code are intentionally memorable. Public severity deters instability by making consequences vivid. Ancient governments lack modern surveillance systems or large professional police forces. Much enforcement depends upon social pressure, local officials, and spectacle. Brutal punishments communicate state power efficiently in environments where centralized control remains fragile. No single explanation fully accounts for why harsh legal codes emerge repeatedly across early civilizations, but rulers likely perceive terror as economically practical. Fear reduces rebellion. Fear discourages theft. Fear reinforces obedience where administrative reach remains limited, at least temporarily. The irony is that even the most detailed laws cannot eliminate the deeper forces threatening ancient societies. Drought still weakens harvests. Rivers still flood unpredictably. Armies still invade. Corrupt officials still exploit ordinary people. Wealth still concentrates upward. Legal systems may contain disorder for generations, yet they cannot erase human ambition, desperation, or environmental fragility. Babylon itself will eventually fall despite its monumental laws. Still, the legacy survives. The Code of Hammurabi becomes one of humanity's clearest early declarations that civilization depends upon publicly defined order enforced by centralized authority. The idea echoes far beyond Mesopotamia. Future empires, kingdoms, and states repeatedly adopt similar assumptions that written laws legitimize power, that punishment preserves stability, and that social hierarchy must be defended against chaos. Yet buried inside the code lies another uncomfortable truth. Justice in the ancient world is never blind. It watches status constantly. And the difference between noble and labourer, man and woman, free and enslaved, may determine whether the law protects you, ignores you, or destroys you. A broken bone does not mean the same thing to every person. Under the laws of ancient Babylon, the injury itself may be identical, but the punishment changes according to who suffers it. Harm a nobleman, and the retaliation can be severe. Harm a labourer, and compensation may replace physical punishment. Harm an enslaved person, and the consequences shift again, often treating the injury partly as damage to property, rather than solely to a human body. The law promises order but not equality. This distinction runs through nearly every early civilization. Modern societies often imagine law as an impartial system, standing above social divisions. Even when reality falls short, ancient legal systems rarely pretend to such neutrality. Hierarchy is not hidden inside the structure. It is the structure. And in many ways, hierarchy appears necessary to the rulers trying to hold these fragile worlds together. By the 2nd millennium BCE, cities across Mesopotamia and neighbouring regions contain increasingly complex social layers. Kings rule over nobles, priests, merchants, labourers, farmers, servants, enslaved captives, migrants, and foreign traders. Wealth accumulates unevenly through land ownership, trade, military success, and political influence. Urban life creates opportunities for social mobility in limited cases, yet also traps enormous numbers of people in debt and dependency. Law becomes one of the primary tools used to organize these unequal relationships. The Code of Hammurabi reveals this openly through its categories. Awilu, often translated as upper-class free men, Mushkenu, commoners or dependents of lower status, Wardu, enslaved people. Each occupies different legal space. Punishments and protections adjust accordingly. This does not mean ancient societies lack moral concern entirely. Many rulers still portray themselves as protectors of vulnerable populations. Widows, orphans, and debtors appear repeatedly in royal inscriptions and legal reforms. Some laws restrict abuses by powerful officials. Others regulate debt slavery or establish obligations toward dependents. Yet these protections operate within systems fundamentally designed to preserve hierarchy, not erase it. What survives in the record suggests that ancient people largely accept inequality as part of the natural order. This acceptance grows partly from economic reality. Agricultural civilizations depend heavily on labor organization. Large estates require workers. Temples manage vast resources. Armies need supplies. Monumental construction projects consume enormous manpower. Social hierarchy helps coordinate these systems, though often through coercion. Religion reinforces the arrangement constantly. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the gods themselves exist within hierarchies mirroring earthly power structures. Kings rule beneath divine authority. Priests mediate sacred knowledge. Families obey patriarchal leadership. Order depends on everyone remaining within assigned roles. To challenge hierarchy risks destabilizing society itself. The family becomes one of the central arenas where this logic operates most intensely. Ancient legal systems devote extraordinary attention to marriage, inheritance, legitimacy, and household authority because families function as economic and political units as much as emotional ones. Property passes through bloodlines. Labor obligations depend on household structure. Alliances between families influence trade and status. Controlling family relationships therefore means controlling the foundations of society. Women occupy complicated positions within these systems. Some women in Mesopotamian cities own property, conduct business, serve as priestesses, or manage households with significant authority. Surviving tablets preserve contracts and economic records involving female participants directly. Yet legal structures overwhelmingly favor male control. Fathers arrange marriages. Husbands possess extensive authority over wives and children. Adultery laws punish women more harshly than men in many circumstances. Divorce rights exist unevenly depending on status and context. The evidence remains incomplete because surviving records reflect elite administrative perspectives more than ordinary voices, but what survives suggests that women navigate systems offering limited protections alongside severe restrictions. Enslaved people face even harsher realities. Slavery appears throughout the ancient world in many forms. War captives, debt slaves, household servants, agricultural laborers. Some individuals may eventually gain freedom or integrate into households over time. Others remain permanently trapped within systems treating them as transferable property. Legal codes regulate their sale, punishment, labor, and escape carefully because slavery underpins significant portions of ancient economies. And yet even enslaved individuals exist inside legal frameworks rather than entirely outside them. This is another paradox of early law. Ancient systems can simultaneously dehumanize certain groups while still recognizing them administratively. A slave may possess limited rights in some contexts while remaining fundamentally owned by another person. The law records marriages, injuries, and obligations involving enslaved individuals because maintaining order requires regulating even unequal relationships. Everything returns to stability. The rulers of ancient civilizations fear uncontrolled conflict more than injustice itself. Extreme inequality may be tolerated for centuries if society remains functional, but widespread instability threatens everyone, including elites. Legal systems therefore attempt to channel tensions into predictable structures before they erupt violently. Debt offers one revealing example. Agricultural economies are highly vulnerable to bad harvests. A single drought, flood, or illness can push farming families into catastrophic debt. Borrowers unable to repay loans may lose land, livestock, or even family members to debt servitude. Over time, wealth concentrates upward as vulnerable households collapse economically. Some ancient rulers recognized the danger this poses. In Mesopotamia, kings occasionally declared debt cancellations or clean slate decrees restoring land and freeing debt slaves under certain conditions. Scholars still debate how regularly these reforms occurred and how effective they were in practice, but the pattern appears repeatedly enough to suggest serious concern. Excessive inequality risks weakening military recruitment, reducing agricultural productivity, and provoking unrest. Law therefore becomes partly an instrument of controlled imbalance. Elites retain power, yet rulers intervene occasionally to prevent total social breakdown. Justice is measured not by equality, but by whether civilization continues functioning. The same logic shapes punishment. A nobleman publicly humiliated or injured threatens political order differently than a laborer suffering the same harm. Crimes against authority figures often receive severe penalties because they symbolize broader challenges to hierarchy itself. Theft from temples or palaces may be punished more harshly than violence against ordinary people. The law protects structures of power first. Still, ordinary citizens likely seek legal recourse whenever possible because alternatives remain worse. Without institutional judgment, disputes easily return to cycles of clan retaliation, bribery, or private violence. Imperfect law still offers predictability, and predictability carries psychological weight in uncertain worlds. Imagine standing inside a crowded Babylonian marketplace beneath crushing heat, while merchants shout over livestock noise and temple bells echo in the distance. You know the laws may not treat you fairly. You know wealthy people possess advantages. You know punishments can be terrifyingly severe. Yet you also know contracts exist, witnesses matter, boundaries are recorded, debts are tracked. There are procedures, however unequal. That fragile structure separates civilization from chaos. But maintaining it requires more than kings and courts alone. Because in the ancient world, human beings believe someone else is always watching. Not merely judges, the gods themselves. The oath is spoken aloud before witnesses, but the real audience is invisible. A merchant swears he has delivered the silver honestly. A farmer promises the boundary stone has not been moved. A husband declares fidelity. A debtor vows repayment after harvest season. Hands may be raised toward temple statues blackened by incense smoke. Sacred objects may be touched. Priests stand nearby, murmuring rituals older than memory itself. Somewhere above the crowded streets and irrigation canals, the gods are believed to listen. And the gods do not forget. In the ancient world, law and religion are fused so tightly that separating them would seem unnatural to most people. Modern societies often distinguish legal systems from spiritual belief, at least in theory. Ancient civilizations rarely do. Divine authority legitimizes kingship, sanctifies contracts, punishes deception, and explains catastrophe. Justice is not merely social, it is cosmic. This changes how people experience obedience. A ruler's officials might not witness every crime. A judge may be bribed, evidence may disappear, witnesses may lie, but supernatural forces see hidden actions constantly. The gods become an extension of legal enforcement in societies where governments lack the administrative reach to monitor ordinary life fully. Fear of divine punishment fills the gaps left by limited state power. Mesopotamian legal culture relies heavily on oaths because written evidence and physical proof are often incomplete. When certainty becomes impossible, sacred declarations attempt to resolve disputes through spiritual risk. A false oath does not merely deceive another human being. It invites divine wrath onto the liar, their household, perhaps even future generations. The threat is terrifying precisely because ancient people inhabit unstable worlds already filled with suffering. Disease arrives without warning. Floods destroy harvests. Children die suddenly. Storms flatten homes. To modern observers, these disasters may appear random or environmental. To many ancient societies, they carry moral significance. Misfortune suggests divine anger somewhere beneath the surface. This belief gives legal systems enormous emotional power. Temples become centers not only of worship, but administration, economics, and justice. In Mesopotamia, temple complexes manage land, labor, storage, trade, and taxation on massive scales. Priests oversee rituals securing divine favor for entire cities. Sacred institutions help regulate daily life because religion itself permeates every aspect of existence. Even measurements become sacred in subtle ways. Weights used in trade must remain honest because dishonest commerce threatens both economic order and moral balance. Boundary stones marking property lines sometimes carry curses, invoking divine punishment against anyone who moves them unlawfully. Contracts may end with elaborate warnings calling upon gods to destroy oath breakers through famine, infertility, disease, or military defeat. The supernatural becomes part of governance. What survives in the archaeological record reveals societies deeply concerned with hidden corruption. False testimony, fraud, secret theft, and broken agreements appear repeatedly in legal texts because trust remains fragile in expanding urban civilizations. Merchants conduct transactions with strangers. Officials manage resources belonging to temples or palaces. Families negotiate inheritance and marriage arrangements involving significant property. Without reliable enforcement, these systems collapse quickly. Religion helps stabilize them psychologically by extending consequences beyond immediate human observation. A person may escape earthly punishment temporarily, but divine justice remains unavoidable, at least in theory. The reality, of course, is more complicated. Ancient people recognize that wicked individuals often prosper while innocent people suffer terribly. Mesopotamian literature contains profound reflections on this contradiction. Some texts describe righteous men overwhelmed by undeserved catastrophe despite faithful devotion to the gods. Others question why corrupt officials thrive while ordinary laborers endure hardship. Scholars still debate how widespread skepticism toward divine justice becomes in ancient societies, because surviving written evidence disproportionately reflects elite and religious perspectives. Yet the existence of such texts reveals something important. Human beings have always noticed the gap between proclaimed order and lived reality. Still, uncertainty often strengthens religious systems rather than weakening them. When disasters strike unpredictably, people search even more intensely for explanations. Did rituals fail? Did rulers offend the gods? Did hidden crimes pollute the community? Ancient legal systems therefore focus heavily on purification as well as punishment. Some crimes are dangerous not only because they harm individuals, but because they threaten collective spiritual balance. This logic appears vividly in trial-by-ordeal practices. In certain Mesopotamian cases where evidence remains uncertain, accused individuals may undergo dangerous tests believed to reveal divine judgment directly. One famous example involves river ordeals. A person accused of wrongdoing may be thrown into a river. Survival suggests innocence. Drowning confirms guilt. To modern minds, the method seems horrifyingly irrational. But within its original context, the ordeal reflects a consistent worldview. Rivers are sacred forces connected to divine power. Human judges may fail, but the gods controlling nature itself cannot be deceived. When earthly certainty becomes impossible, supernatural judgment intervenes. No single explanation fully accounts for why ordeal systems persist across so many cultures worldwide, but they likely serve several functions simultaneously. They externalize responsibility away from human judges. They reinforce belief in divine order. They intimidate potential criminals psychologically, and sometimes, perhaps, they simply provide closure in situations where evidence cannot resolve conflict. Religion also helps rulers justify inequality. Kings present themselves as chosen protectors maintaining sacred harmony. Social hierarchy becomes morally reinforced through myths describing cosmic order mirrored on Earth. Obedience to authority therefore acquires spiritual meaning. Rebellion threatens not merely governments, but divine structure itself. The ancient Egyptians expressed this through the concept of ma'at, the balance sustaining civilization against chaos. Similar ideas appear across the ancient Near East in different forms. Justice means maintaining proper order within creation. Laws protect that order. Punishments restore it when violated. And always chaos waits nearby. The fear of collapse never disappears from ancient consciousness, because collapse remains historically common. Cities burn, dynasties fall, drought empties once fertile lands. Foreign armies arrive suddenly from distant frontiers. Entire populations migrate under environmental pressure or military conquest. People living through these cycles do not experience civilization as permanent. They experience it as fragile. Religion offers reassurance that order possesses deeper foundations than human power alone. Yet the same systems can justify extraordinary cruelty. When rulers believe they act with divine approval, punishment becomes morally amplified. Executions may appear righteous rather than political. Wars become sacred campaigns. Enemies transform into threats against cosmic balance itself. Throughout history, law fused with religion often produces both social cohesion and devastating violence. Ancient societies are no exception. Still, for ordinary people struggling to survive beside unpredictable rivers and unstable kingdoms, sacred law may provide genuine comfort alongside fear. Rituals create continuity. Oaths establish trust. Temples distribute food during crises. Divine justice promises meaning in worlds where suffering often appears arbitrary. The gods are watching. The kings are watching. The community is watching. And in civilizations built upon fear of disorder, visibility itself becomes a form of control. Soon, that control will grow even harsher. Because some rulers will conclude that laws alone are not enough to preserve civilization. People must also be terrified. The condemned man is led through the city slowly enough for everyone to see him. Dust rises around his feet as guards force him forward beneath the hard afternoon sun. Market stalls fall quiet as people turn to watch. Children stare from shaded doorways. Merchants pause in the middle of transactions. Somewhere nearby, temple smoke drifts upward into the heat while drums echo faintly against mud brick walls. The punishment itself matters, but the audience matters more. Ancient justice is often public theatre. Across the early civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, Assyria, and beyond, rulers understand something deeply uncomfortable about human societies. Fear can bind populations together more efficiently than trust alone. A written law hidden inside archives carries limited power if ordinary people do not believe consequences are real. Punishment must therefore become visible. The body becomes a warning. What survives in legal records and royal inscriptions reveals a world where penalties are frequently severe, physical, and deliberately memorable. Executions, floggings, mutilations, branding, forced labour, public humiliation, drowning, impalement, amputation. Some punishments target the body directly. Others destroy social identity through exile or enslavement. The methods vary between cultures and centuries, but the underlying logic remains strikingly consistent. Disorder must appear terrifyingly expensive. This is especially true in societies where centralized governments remain administratively limited. Ancient states possess no modern forensic systems, no extensive prison networks, no constant surveillance infrastructure. Most cities rely on relatively small numbers of officials overseeing enormous populations spread across farms, canals, workshops, and trade routes. Fear compensates for limited reach. If people police themselves through terror of punishment, the state requires fewer enforcers. The Assyrians later elevate this principle into an art form of imperial intimidation. Royal inscriptions from the Neo-Assyrian Empire describe conquered enemies flayed, impaled, beheaded, or deported in language so graphic that modern readers sometimes assume exaggeration. Scholars indeed caution that Assyrian kings deliberately amplify brutality for propaganda purposes. Terrifying enemies is itself strategic communication. Yet archaeology confirms that Assyrian warfare is genuinely harsh by ancient standards. Entire populations are relocated forcibly across vast distances to weaken rebellion and redistribute labor. Cities resisting imperial authority suffer catastrophic destruction. Palaces display carved reliefs depicting sieges, executions, and submission rituals with chilling detail. The empire governs partly through psychological shock. To modern observers, such violence may seem monstrous beyond comprehension, but within the Assyrian worldview, terror serves order. Rebellion threatens roads, trade, taxation, agricultural production, and political stability across a fragile empire surrounded by rivals. Fear reduces resistance before armies even arrive. No single explanation fully accounts for why ancient punishments become so visibly brutal, but environmental and political instability likely contribute significantly. Civilizations living close to subsistence thresholds often perceive disruption as existential danger. A sabotage canal may trigger famine. Banditry may collapse trade routes. Local revolts may spread rapidly between dissatisfied populations. Under such conditions, rulers increasingly treat mercy as risk. The legal systems of ancient societies therefore reveal an unsettling tension between restraint and spectacle. On one hand, laws attempt to regulate violence systematically. Private revenge becomes restricted. Courts replace some feuds. Compensation resolves certain disputes. On the other hand, states centralize violence into organized public punishment designed to intimidate entire populations. Civilization reduces chaos partly by monopolizing cruelty. This pattern extends beyond kings and armies into everyday judicial practices. In some regions, accused individuals endure ordeals testing divine favor through dangerous trials. Elsewhere, physical punishment reinforces class hierarchy directly. A noble may pay fines where a laborer receives beatings. Enslaved individuals often suffer harsher corporal penalties because the law treats them simultaneously as human beings and property. The body becomes political territory. Ancient legal systems rarely separate punishment from symbolism. Cutting off a thief's hand does more than disable stealing physically. It marks the criminal permanently before the community. Public execution demonstrates the ruler's capacity to destroy disorder visibly. Humiliation rituals strip away social identity alongside physical suffering. And yet ancient societies do not rely exclusively on terror. This complexity matters. Most daily disputes likely never reach extreme punishment at all. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests negotiation, compensation, mediation, and local settlement remain common. Merchants continue trading, families arrange marriages, farmers share irrigation systems. Ordinary life depends upon cooperation far more often than violence. The dramatic punishments survive disproportionately in historical memory because states publicize them intentionally. Royal inscriptions celebrate decisive justice. Legal monuments emphasize consequences. Monumental art depicts enemies crushed beneath imperial authority. Governments advertise punishment because fear works best when visible. Still, the strategy carries risks. Excessive brutality can deepen resentment rather than obedience. Conquered populations rebel repeatedly despite terrifying consequences. Harsh debt systems drive families into desperation. Corrupt officials abuse legal authority for personal gain. Civilizations seeking stability through fear alone often discover that terror produces only temporary compliance. The evidence for this appears throughout ancient history. The Assyrian Empire, despite its immense military power, eventually collapses with shocking speed during the late 7th century BCE. Babylon itself falls repeatedly across centuries. Egyptian dynasties fracture during periods of famine, invasion, and internal unrest. No civilization discovers a permanent formula for order, because beneath the laws and punishments lies a deeper truth rulers struggle constantly to suppress. Human beings are unpredictable. Crowds panic, armies mutiny, elites betray one another. Desperate populations revolt under economic pressure. Even the harshest legal systems cannot eliminate ambition, fear, hunger, jealousy, or grief. They can only channel these forces temporarily. Ancient rulers seem to understand this instinctively. Many legal codes focus not merely on punishing crimes after they occur, but on preserving trust before society fractures completely. Contracts must hold, boundaries must remain stable, families must reproduce legitimate heirs, debts must remain manageable enough to avoid widespread collapse. Punishment alone cannot sustain civilization forever. The deeper challenge is creating systems where strangers cooperate voluntarily, often enough to keep cities functioning. Farmers must believe irrigation labour benefits them. Merchants must trust trade agreements. Soldiers must remain loyal. Labourers must continue working despite inequality. This requires something beyond fear. It requires shared expectations. And nowhere does that become more important than in commerce itself, where expanding trade networks begin connecting distant populations who possess no kinship ties whatsoever. In the ancient world, survival increasingly depends upon trusting complete strangers, which means law must evolve again. Because rivers, roads, and caravans are carrying civilization farther than memory alone can follow. The caravan moves slowly across the open plain beneath a pale horizon blurred by heat and dust. Donkeys carry wool textiles packed beside jars of oil and bundles of tin bound for distant workshops. Guards walk alongside merchants who have spent months preparing for this journey, calculating risks that cannot be controlled completely. Somewhere ahead lie foreign cities speaking unfamiliar dialects, governed by different rulers, worshipping different gods. Somewhere behind remain creditors expecting repayment after the caravan returns. Every mile travelled increases the possibility of theft, illness, betrayal, or ruin. And yet the trade continues. By the 2nd millennium BCE, the ancient world is becoming economically interconnected on a scale earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Mesopotamian merchants exchange goods with Anatolia, the Levant, the Persian Gulf, and beyond. Egyptian expeditions seek timber, gold, incense, and luxury materials from distant lands. Indus Valley products appear far from their origins. Maritime trade routes stretch across dangerous seas while overland caravans cross deserts and mountains, vulnerable to raiders and weather alike. Civilization is no longer local. This transformation creates extraordinary wealth, but also extraordinary legal problems. Trade between strangers cannot rely entirely on kinship or personal familiarity. A merchant lending silver to a partner hundreds of miles away needs some assurance that agreements will survive absence. Investors financing caravans require systems for dividing profits and losses. Buyers need confidence that weights and measures remain honest. Debtors and creditors need recognized procedures when harvests fail or shipments disappear. Commerce forces law to become more abstract. What survives in the archaeological record reveals an astonishingly sophisticated world of contracts and financial arrangements developing thousands of years before modern banking. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia preserve partnership agreements, shipping records, loans, receipts, inheritance settlements, and business disputes in remarkable detail. Some merchants operate family firms spanning multiple cities. Others engage in long-distance ventures involving shared investment and risk. The legal infrastructure supporting this economy grows steadily more complex. Interest rates are regulated. Property rights become carefully documented. Contracts specify witnesses, repayment schedules, collateral, and penalties. Standardized weights and measurements help facilitate exchange across regions. Courts adjudicate commercial disputes because private vengeance would destroy trade networks rapidly. Trust becomes economically valuable. And trust is difficult to maintain in expanding civilizations where strangers interact constantly without shared loyalties. One revealing example emerges from the Assyrian merchant colonies established in Anatolia during the early 2nd millennium BCE. At sites like Kanesh, archaeologists uncover thousands of cuneiform tablets documenting extensive trade systems linking Mesopotamia with distant markets. Merchants communicate through letters discussing debts, delayed shipments, taxes, family matters, and legal conflicts with striking emotional immediacy. Some plead desperately for repayment. Others complain about dishonest partners or corrupt officials. Behind the formal contracts lies a world of anxiety remarkably familiar to modern commerce. The evidence suggests that these trade networks depend heavily on both legal systems and personal reputation simultaneously. Contracts alone cannot eliminate risk. Communication remains painfully slow. A caravan disappearing into desert terrain may leave investors ruined long before explanations arrive. Merchants therefore cultivate networks of trust reinforced through family ties, partnerships, religious obligations, and legal agreements together. Law supports commerce, but cannot replace human reliability entirely. This balance becomes especially important because debt spreads through ancient societies relentlessly. Agricultural economies are unstable by nature. A drought, flood, locust swarm, or military raid can destroy harvests overnight. Farmers borrow grain or silver to survive bad seasons. Merchants finance risky expeditions through loans. Families mortgage land, livestock, or labor obligations under financial pressure. Over time, debt becomes one of the most powerful forces shaping ancient civilization, and one of the most dangerous. What survives in Mesopotamian records reveals societies repeatedly struggling with the consequences of escalating indebtedness. Vulnerable households lose property, children enter debt servitude, small farmers become dependent laborers under wealthy elites or temple institutions. Economic inequality deepens generation after generation unless interrupted by crisis or reform. Some rulers respond pragmatically. As earlier legal traditions already suggest, kings occasionally proclaim debt cancellations, restoring land and freeing debt slaves under certain conditions. These decrees are not modern humanitarian reforms in any simple sense. They are survival strategies for the state itself. Excessive concentration of wealth threatens military recruitment, agricultural stability, and social cohesion. A civilization drowning in debt risks rebellion or collapse. No single explanation fully accounts for how ancient economies maintained balance as long as they did. But periodic intervention appears crucial. Rulers tolerate inequality up to the point where instability threatens broader order. The law therefore operates partly as economic pressure control. Trade law also transforms ideas about evidence and documentation. Commercial transactions require records durable enough to survive distance and time. Witnesses remain important, but written contracts increasingly anchor legal certainty. Seals pressed into clay authenticate agreements. Archives preserve obligations across generations. Merchants travelling far from home carry tablets proving ownership, debt arrangements, or royal permissions. Writing and commerce become inseparable. The ancient world slowly discovers that large-scale economies require institutional memory extending beyond individual lifetimes. A merchant may die before repayment arrives. An inheritance dispute may emerge decades after an agreement is made. Written records stabilize expectations across time in ways oral tradition alone cannot sustain. Yet economic law remains deeply unequal. Elite merchants and temple institutions possess enormous advantages over ordinary laborers or small farmers. Interest can trap families permanently. Corruption distorts outcomes. Legal systems often favor those with wealth, connections, and literacy. Enslaved individuals themselves may be bought and sold through meticulously recorded contracts. The same commercial sophistication that expands civilization also intensifies exploitation. Still, trade changes human society profoundly in ways extending beyond economics alone. Merchants carry ideas, technologies, religious practices, and legal concepts between regions. Cultures interact through commerce long before empires unify territories politically. Legal innovations spread because successful trade depends on compatible expectations between distant populations. A contract written in one city may influence practice hundreds of miles away. Slowly, civilization begins creating shared frameworks larger than individual kingdoms. This interconnectedness also increases vulnerability. A disrupted trade route can trigger shortages across entire regions. War in one territory may damage economies elsewhere unexpectedly. Political instability spreads through commercial networks. Ancient civilizations become increasingly dependent upon systems too large for any single ruler to control completely. The caravans crossing deserts and mountains therefore carry more than goods. They carry civilization's growing dependence on strangers behaving predictably. And nowhere is predictability considered more important than inside the household itself. Because while kings issue laws and merchants sign contracts, ancient societies believe true order begins somewhere smaller and more intimate. Inside the family, the marriage contract is pressed into wet clay while witnesses stand nearby beneath the heavy heat of the afternoon. Dowry amounts are listed carefully, property agreements are recorded, obligations between families are defined in precise language meant to survive memory and dispute alike. Somewhere outside, donkeys move through crowded streets and merchants bargain beneath woven awnings. But inside this quiet administrative space, another kind of transaction is unfolding. Two households are binding themselves together economically, socially, and legally. Love may exist within the arrangement, but survival matters more. In the ancient world, the family is not primarily a private emotional unit in the modern sense. It is infrastructure. Households produce labor, preserve inheritance, transmit status, organize property, care for the elderly, and ensure legitimate descendants who can maintain continuity across generations. Civilization itself depends upon stable households capable of reproducing social order from one generation to the next. Law therefore reaches deeply into domestic life. Ancient legal systems regulate marriage, divorce, inheritance, sexuality, legitimacy, adoption, and parental authority with extraordinary intensity because rulers understand something fundamental. A society unable to control family relationships risks broader instability. Property disputes multiply. bloodlines become contested. Inheritance fractures wealth and political alliances unpredictably. Vulnerable children become economic burdens. Household conflict spills outward into wider communities. The family becomes the first battlefield where order confronts chaos. What survives in Mesopotamian legal records reveals remarkably detailed concern with household structure. Marriage contracts specify dowries, inheritance rights, obligations of support, and conditions for separation. Adoption agreements preserve lineage where biological heirs are absent. Laws govern adultery, widowhood, legitimacy, and paternal authority carefully because these issues affect not only individuals, but the economic foundations of society itself. A legitimate son means continuity of land ownership. An illegitimate heir may mean future conflict. Everything connects back to stability. Women occupy central yet constrained positions within this system. In Mesopotamia and many neighboring civilizations, women can sometimes own property, conduct business, inherit under certain conditions, or serve important religious roles. Some elite women wield considerable influence within palace and temple structures. Surviving tablets preserve records of female merchants, priestesses, and estate managers participating actively in economic life. Yet patriarchal authority remains dominant almost everywhere. Fathers arrange marriages. Husbands exercise legal control over households. Female sexuality becomes heavily regulated because inheritance systems depend upon certainty regarding paternity. Adultery laws often punish women more severely than men. Divorce rights vary according to class and circumstance, but men generally possess greater legal freedom. The law protects family structure partly by controlling women's reproductive and economic roles. Modern readers may find this deeply oppressive, and in many ways it is. But ancient societies perceive these controls differently because household stability underpins survival directly. In agricultural civilizations with high mortality rates and limited social safety systems, family networks provide labor, protection, inheritance continuity, and old age support. Disorder inside households threatens broader economic systems quickly. Children themselves occupy ambiguous positions within these legal frameworks. They are loved, certainly. Ancient parents mourn dead children with heartbreaking intensity visible in surviving texts and burial practices, but children are also labor resources, heirs, and future caretakers. Fathers possess extensive authority over them in many legal systems. In extreme debt situations, children may even enter servitude temporarily to satisfy obligations. The evidence remains incomplete regarding how ordinary families experience these pressures emotionally, because legal records preserve structure more readily than feeling, yet glimpses survive occasionally. Letters reveal parental anxiety, marital disputes, sibling conflicts, and affection hidden beneath formal language. Civilization depends on intimate relationships as much as armies or laws. This becomes especially clear during inheritance disputes. Property transmission across generations represents one of the central concerns of ancient law because land, livestock, workshops, and commercial assets determine long-term family survival. Without clear inheritance rules, conflict can fracture households and destabilize communities rapidly. Legal systems therefore devote enormous attention to succession. Who inherits if a father dies without sons? What rights does a widow retain? How are adopted children treated? Can daughters inherit property? The answers vary between cultures and centuries, but the underlying concern remains constant. Civilization requires continuity across generations. This continuity becomes fragile during crisis. War kills large numbers of men. Disease wipes out households suddenly. Famine drives families into debt or migration. Political collapse disrupts inheritance systems entirely. Ancient societies experience these disruptions repeatedly, which may partly explain why legal systems attempt to regulate family life so intensely. The household is both emotionally vulnerable and economically essential. Religion reinforces domestic order constantly. Marriage often carries sacred dimensions alongside legal ones. Ancestor worship in some cultures links family continuity to spiritual obligations toward the dead. Household rituals seek divine protection over fertility, childbirth, and prosperity. The gods themselves are frequently imagined through family metaphors of fathers, mothers, sons, and divine dynasties. Cosmic order mirrors household order, and household disorder threatens cosmic balance symbolically as well as practically. This logic appears starkly in laws governing sexual behavior. Adultery, incest, illegitimacy, and disputed paternity are treated not merely as personal matters, but as dangers capable of destabilizing inheritance systems and social trust. Punishments may therefore become severe. Public shame, execution, mutilation, or forced separation appear in various legal traditions depending on the offense and social status involved. No single explanation fully accounts for the intensity with which ancient civilizations regulate domestic life. But part of the answer likely lies in demographic fragility. Infant mortality remains devastatingly high. Women face significant danger during childbirth. Average life expectancy is low by modern standards. Families operate constantly under threat of sudden disruption. Law attempts to impose predictability onto biological uncertainty itself. At the same time, the household also becomes a site of resistance and negotiation beneath official structures. People circumvent laws, conceal relationships, manipulate inheritance, and negotiate informal arrangements constantly. The surviving records occasionally reveal women defending property rights aggressively, adopted heirs contesting status, or families restructuring obligations creatively during hardship. Human beings rarely fit perfectly inside legal categories. Ancient rulers understand this imperfectly but persistently. Laws multiply because reality keeps escaping neat control. Every regulation creates new ambiguities. Every inheritance rule produces unexpected disputes. Every marriage contract encounters the unpredictability of human desire, grief, ambition, and fear. Still, civilization continues trying. Because from the perspective of kings and administrators, stable households produce stable states. Families raise laborers, soldiers, taxpayers, priests, and heirs. Domestic order supports agricultural order, economic order, and political order alike. And soon, as empires expand across enormous territories containing many different peoples, rulers will attempt something even more difficult. They will try to impose legal order not merely upon households or cities, but across entire worlds of strangers. The empire stretches farther than any messenger can travel quickly. Weeks pass before orders from the capital reach distant provinces. By the time a governor receives instructions, conditions may already have changed completely. Floods reshape riverbanks. Local rebellions flare unexpectedly. Crops fail in one region while another prospers. Merchants complain about taxes in unfamiliar dialects. Tribal confederations move along frontiers beyond direct control. Somewhere at the edge of imperial territory, soldiers stare across deserts, mountains, or forests into lands the king claims but cannot fully see. And yet the empire insists upon order anyway. As ancient states grow larger, law faces a challenge far greater than regulating single cities or local kingdoms. Diversity itself becomes the problem. Different peoples possess different customs, gods, inheritance traditions, trade systems, and concepts of justice. A ruler governing vast territories must decide whether to impose uniform rules or tolerate local variation. Most empires attempt both simultaneously. The Assyrians, Babylonians, Hittites, Persians, and later many others discover that controlling large populations requires a balance between centralized authority and practical flexibility. Too much local independence risks fragmentation. Too much imposed uniformity risks rebellion. Law becomes imperial glue. The Neo-Assyrian Empire demonstrates one solution through overwhelming administrative control backed by military terror. Provincial governors oversee taxation, labor obligations, and military recruitment while royal officials monitor loyalty constantly. Roads connect distant territories with unprecedented efficiency. Written communication flows through expanding bureaucratic systems. Deportations relocate conquered populations strategically to weaken resistance and redistribute skilled labor. The empire manages diversity partly by uprooting it. What survives in Assyrian records reveals astonishing administrative ambition. Officials track tribute payments, agricultural production, troop movements, and regional unrest across enormous distances. Law supports extraction. Conquered peoples owe taxes, labor, and obedience to the imperial center. But the Assyrians also learn the limits of force. Constant warfare strains resources. Brutality creates resentment. Vast territories become expensive to maintain. Rebellions erupt repeatedly despite terrifying punishments. The empire expands rapidly, yet beneath its military power lies chronic instability. Eventually, or even Assyria collapses with shocking speed in the late 7th century BCE. Great cities burn, royal palaces are abandoned. The empire that once seemed unstoppable disappears into ruin. Its laws and armies cannot save it forever. The Persians later attempt a different approach. Under rulers like Cyrus the Great and Darius I, the Achaemenid Empire governs an enormous multicultural territory stretching from Egypt to Central Asia. Instead of erasing local traditions completely, Persian administration often incorporates them pragmatically. Subject peoples may retain local customs, religions, and legal practices so long as tribute flows and imperial authority remains acknowledged. This flexibility becomes one of the empire's greatest strengths. Royal roads improve communication across vast distances. Standardized taxation and coinage support commerce. Provincial satraps govern regions while remaining accountable to the king. Imperial inscriptions emphasize justice, truth, and order against the forces of rebellion and deceit. Darius especially presents himself as defender of cosmic and political stability. In the famous Behistun inscription carved high into a cliff face, he describes crushing revolts and restoring rightful order across the empire. Rebels are portrayed not merely as political enemies, but as liars threatening the moral structure of civilization itself. Truth and law become inseparable from imperial legitimacy. This idea echoes through many ancient empires. Rulers rarely describe conquest as simple domination. They frame it as restoration of proper order against chaos, corruption, or illegitimate rebellion. The empire claims to bring stability, roads, irrigation, trade, and justice to fractured lands. Sometimes this claim contains genuine truth. Empires can reduce local warfare, facilitate commerce, and create administrative continuity across large regions. But they also extract wealth relentlessly. Taxes flow toward imperial centers, labor builds roads, palaces, temples, and fortifications. Conquered populations serve foreign rulers whose priorities may differ sharply from local needs. Imperial law often protects stability more effectively than freedom. Still, many ordinary people likely adapt pragmatically because survival depends upon functioning systems regardless of who rules them. Farmers need irrigation maintained, merchants need roads protected from bandits, cities need grain distribution during shortages. Legal predictability matters even under foreign authority. What survives in the historical record suggests that ancient empires succeed when they provide enough stability to outweigh the burdens they impose. This balance remains fragile. Communication delays constantly undermine centralized control. Corruption spreads through distant administrations. Provincial elites manipulate local systems for personal gain. Different legal traditions collide unexpectedly. Even measuring taxes fairly across diverse regions becomes enormously difficult. The evidence from ancient Egypt during periods of imperial control reveals similar tensions. Local customs persist beneath centralized authority. Priests, scribes, military officials, and governors compete for influence. Royal decrees may proclaim ideal order while ordinary disputes continue shaped by practical compromise at local levels. No empire fully standardizes justice. The Roman Empire later confronts the same challenge on an even larger scale, but the pattern already exists much earlier. Law expands with power, yet local realities continually reshape enforcement. Imperial legal systems remain layered, inconsistent, and deeply dependent on human judgment. And human judgment is vulnerable to fear, greed, loyalty, and ambition. Corruption appears everywhere in ancient records because officials controlling taxes, courts, and labor possess enormous opportunities for abuse. Some kings issue reforms attempting to restrain exploitation by governors or tax collectors. Others ignore corruption so long as revenues continue flowing. The tension never disappears because empires require intermediaries to govern distant populations. The farther power extends, the harder justice becomes. At the same time, imperial law transforms human identity gradually. People increasingly interact through categories defined by states rather than kinship alone. Taxpayer, citizen, subject, soldier, merchant, provincial governor. Legal status expands beyond local clan relationships into larger administrative systems. Civilization becomes more abstract. A merchant traveling imperial roads may conduct business across multiple cultures under shared commercial protections. Soldiers from different regions serve inside the same armies. Written laws circulate farther than ever before. Empires create interconnected worlds, where strangers coexist beneath centralized authority, despite profound cultural differences. Yet beneath this growing complexity, ancient fears remain unchanged. Floods still threaten harvests. Disease still spreads through crowded cities. Armies still invade frontiers. Dynasties still collapse suddenly after weak rulers inherit power. The empire may appear eternal at its height, but history repeatedly proves otherwise. And when legal systems weaken under pressure, something old begins returning quickly. Corruption deepens. Trust erodes. Violence spreads. Civilization remembers how thin the line between order and chaos has always been. At first, the signs are small enough to ignore. A canal repair is delayed because officials claim the treasury lacks workers. Grain shipments arrive late to provincial storehouses. Merchants begin hiding silver rather than investing it openly. Farmers quietly abandon overtaxed land near the edge of imperial territory. Judges accept gifts that are no longer even disguised as gifts. Soldiers go unpaid for too long. The laws remain written. The monuments still stand. but something underneath them is beginning to weaken. Ancient civilizations rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. More often, order erodes gradually while rulers insist everything remains stable. Administrative systems continue functioning outwardly long after trust inside them has started decaying. The machinery of law still exists, yet fewer people believe it protects them fairly. Corruption spreads through institutions because survival increasingly depends on personal advantage rather than collective stability. The old fear returns. That chaos is waiting just beyond the walls. What survives in the historical and archaeological record suggests that many ancient states understand corruption not merely as moral failure, but as existential danger. Royal inscriptions repeatedly condemn dishonest officials, bribery, false accounting, illegal seizure of property, and abuse of vulnerable populations. Kings portray themselves as reformers restoring justice against greedy administrators. The repetition itself is revealing. If rulers must constantly proclaim the elimination of corruption, corruption is likely persistent. This makes sense. Ancient governments depend heavily on human intermediaries. Tax collectors oversee grain storage, local governors enforce laws, priests manage temple wealth, scribes control records ordinary people cannot read, military commanders supervise labor and tribute extraction. Every layer of administration creates opportunities for manipulation, and ancient societies possess limited mechanisms for oversight. Communication remains slow, evidence is fragile, literacy is restricted. Powerful families protect one another through alliances and influence. In distant provinces especially, imperial authority often relies more on negotiation than direct control. A corrupt official may exploit communities for years before complaints reach the capital, if they ever do. The evidence from late Bronze Age states reveals how dangerous these accumulated weaknesses can become. By the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, several major civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East experienced severe disruption almost simultaneously. The Mycenaean palaces collapse, the Hittite Empire disappears, trade networks fragment, cities burn or are abandoned. Egypt survives but weakens significantly. Scholars still debate the exact causes because no single explanation fully accounts for the scale of the crisis. Climate change likely contributes. Drought evidence appears across multiple regions. Famine may have destabilized already strained societies. Earthquakes damage urban centers. Trade disruptions weaken economies dependent on imported resources. Internal rebellions erupt. Migrating groups and invasions intensify instability. But beneath these immediate pressures lies a deeper pattern. Highly interconnected civilizations become vulnerable when trust in institutions begins breaking down. Legal systems depend on functioning administrations. Administrations depend on resources, communication, and legitimacy. Once governments lose the ability to maintain order predictably, ordinary people begin adapting individually rather than collectively. Farmers hide grain, officials hoard wealth, local elites strengthen private defenses, soldiers switch loyalties, merchants avoid dangerous routes. Civilization fragments from within before enemies destroy it from outside. The late Bronze Age collapse demonstrates how quickly complex systems can unravel. Entire writing traditions disappear in some regions. Monumental construction ceases. Long-distance trade shrinks dramatically. Populations decline or migrate. Cities that once seemed permanent vanish beneath layers of ash and abandonment. And with collapse comes legal disappearance. Courts stop functioning. Contracts lose enforceability. Tax systems fail. Property records become meaningless when states can no longer protect ownership consistently. In many regions, people retreat towards smaller local identities because larger political structures no longer provide reliable security. The ancient nightmare returns. Not merely violence, but unpredictability. Scholars still debate how ordinary people experience these collapses emotionally because the surviving evidence remains uneven. Yet archaeology reveals unmistakable trauma. Burned settlements, hastily abandoned homes, fortified hilltop refuges replacing open urban centres, storage hoards buried and never recovered. People stop trusting permanence. This pattern repeats throughout history repeatedly. The Akkadian Empire weakens under environmental pressure and political fragmentation. Assyria falls after decades of warfare and internal strain. Egyptian authority fractures during intermediate periods marked by famine, decentralization, and rival dynasties. Even powerful Rome centuries later will struggle against corruption, economic imbalance, military instability, and administrative overextension. No legal system proves immortal. One reason may lie in a contradiction embedded within civilization from the beginning. States promise order, yet maintaining order often requires concentrating power and wealth unevenly. Over time, elites can become insulated from the systems governing ordinary populations. Laws exist publicly, but enforcement grows selective. Institutions serving collective survival increasingly serve private interests instead. At that point, legitimacy begins eroding. Ancient texts occasionally preserve remarkable honesty about this process. Egyptian writings from periods of instability describe social inversion and collapsing trust. Mesopotamian laments mourn ruined cities abandoned by protective gods. Biblical traditions later preserve memories of corrupt judges and rulers destroying justice through greed. Across cultures, civilizations repeatedly imagine disorder arriving not only through foreign invasion, but through moral decay inside leadership itself. The line between corruption and collapse becomes difficult to separate. And yet ancient societies also display extraordinary resilience. After destruction, cities are often rebuilt atop older ruins. New dynasties emerge. Trade networks recover partially. Legal traditions survive through copied texts and institutional memory. Human beings repeatedly reconstruct order even after catastrophic failure. This resilience may explain why rulers continue investing so heavily in law despite constant setbacks. Written systems preserve continuity beyond individual lifetimes. Even collapsed civilizations leave behind administrative habits, legal concepts, and cultural expectations influencing successor societies. The memory of order survives collapse itself. Still, rebuilding never fully erases fear. Imagine standing inside the ruins of a once powerful city where temple roofs have collapsed inward and weeds push through cracked courtyards. Burned archives lie scattered beneath dust. Clay tablets once recording debts, marriages, taxes, and judgments now sit broken beneath fallen walls. The legal machinery that organized thousands of lives has become silent matter. Civilization suddenly looks temporary. And perhaps that is why later societies preserve ancient laws so carefully. Not because the laws are perfect, but because they represent humanity's ongoing refusal to surrender entirely to disorder. Even after collapse, especially after collapse, the empire is gone, but the law remains. Centuries after Babylonian kings disappear into history, scribes still copy fragments of older legal traditions onto fresh tablets. Long after Assyrian armies vanish from the Near East, administrative habits shaped under imperial rule continue influencing local governance. Ruined cities collapse into dust, yet ideas about contracts, punishment, authority, inheritance, and justice survive through memory, religion and imitation. Civilization forgets slowly. This is one of the strangest patterns in human history. Political systems collapse repeatedly, but legal concepts often outlive the societies that first created them. The laws change language, shift meaning, merge with new traditions, and adapt to different religions. Yet traces remain recognizable across thousands of years. The ancient world never fully disappears. Mesopotamian legal thinking influences later Near Eastern societies profoundly, though not always directly or cleanly. The Hebrew Bible preserves legal traditions shaped partly within the same broader cultural environment that produced Babylonian and Assyrian law. Some similarities are striking. Rules concerning property, injury, inheritance, slavery, debt, and sexual conduct echo earlier Mesopotamian structures, while also reshaping them through different religious and moral frameworks. Scholars still debate the exact lines of influence because legal traditions evolve through centuries of adaptation rather than simple copying. Yet the broader continuity remains difficult to ignore. The idea that law should be written publicly survives. The idea that rulers possess responsibility for justice survives. The idea that social order depends on enforceable codes survives. Even the principle often summarized as an eye for an eye appears in multiple traditions, though frequently misunderstood by modern audiences. In its original context, such principles may actually limit revenge by preventing escalation beyond proportional response. The law attempts to contain violence within boundaries rather than allowing unlimited retaliation. Restraint through structure. The Greeks later inherit and transform many earlier concepts while developing new legal and political experiments of their own. City-states like Athens begin exploring ideas of citizenship, civic participation, and codified law in ways distinct from older monarchic systems. Yet even there, ancient patterns persist. Law still protects hierarchy. Slavery remains foundational. Women remain excluded from most political power. Public punishment continues shaping social order. Civilization evolves unevenly. Then comes Rome. Few societies shape later legal traditions more profoundly than the Roman Republic and Empire. Roman law develops gradually across centuries through legislation, court decisions, administrative practice, and philosophical interpretation. Unlike earlier Mesopotamian systems focused heavily on royal authority, Roman legal culture increasingly emphasizes procedures, categories, and institutional continuity. The law becomes portable. Roman citizenship expands across enormous territories containing diverse populations. Contracts, property rights, inheritance systems, and commercial regulations grow more sophisticated alongside imperial expansion. Legal specialists emerge as influential interpreters of increasingly complex systems. Written law evolves into something approaching an independent framework surviving political transitions themselves. And still, older fears remain visible beneath the sophistication. Roman thinkers worry constantly about corruption, social decay, concentration of wealth, political instability, and mob violence. The Republic eventually collapses into civil wars partly because legal institutions cannot contain elite competition and military ambition indefinitely. Augustus restores stability by concentrating power while preserving the appearance of republican legality. Order survives. Freedom changes shape. This pattern repeats so often throughout history that it begins to feel almost structural. Societies facing chaos frequently accept stronger centralized authority in exchange for stability. Ancient rulers understood this instinctively. Later empires rediscover it repeatedly. Religion also carries legal memory forward powerfully. As Christianity spreads through the Roman world and beyond, church institutions preserve administrative knowledge, literacy, and legal traditions during periods of political fragmentation. Canon law develops gradually alongside secular law, blending Roman legal concepts with theological principles. Islamic civilizations later create extraordinarily sophisticated legal traditions of their own, while also inheriting administrative practices from earlier empires. Civilizations overlap more than they replace one another. The medieval world, often imagined incorrectly as legally primitive, actually preserves dense layers of inherited tradition. Roman law survives in modified form. Germanic customary systems interact with Christian theology. Islamic legal scholarship flourishes across vast territories. Jewish legal traditions continue evolving through commentary and interpretation, rooted partly in much older Near Eastern frameworks. The ancient obsession with order never disappears. Neither does the fear beneath it. What survives in legal history reveals humanity struggling endlessly with the same underlying tensions. How much power should rulers possess? How can violence be restrained without creating tyranny? Who counts as fully protected under the law? Can justice exist in unequal societies? Does stability matter more than freedom during crisis? The answers shift across cultures and centuries, yet no civilization escapes the questions themselves. Even modern legal systems still contain echoes of ancient assumptions. Contracts remain foundational to economic life. Written law still claims authority beyond individual rulers. Courts continue attempting to replace personal vengeance with institutional judgment. Governments still justify power partly through promises of security and stability, and punishment still carries symbolic meaning. Public executions have largely disappeared in many parts of the world, yet states continue displaying authority through prisons, policing, surveillance, and legal spectacle. Modern societies often describe themselves as more rational than ancient civilizations. But fear remains central to governance everywhere. Fear of crime, fear of disorder, fear of collapse. The technologies change. The psychology endures. No single explanation fully accounts for why legal traditions persist so stubbornly across human history. But perhaps part of the answer lies in memory itself. Civilizations remember collapse even when they no longer remember its details clearly. The ruins of older societies linger physically across landscapes. Abandoned cities become cautionary shadows. Historical texts preserve stories of kingdoms destroyed through corruption, division, arrogance, or violence. Every generation inherits warnings from the dead. Sometimes those warnings become myths, sometimes they become laws. And deep beneath modern institutions, beneath constitutions and courtrooms and bureaucracies far removed from ancient river valleys, one old belief still survives almost unchanged. That civilization is fragile. That order does not maintain itself automatically. And that somewhere beyond the reach of law, chaos continues waiting patiently, just as it waited beside the first cities thousands of years ago. The fear never truly leaves. It survives inside every wall built around a city, every prison constructed beyond public view, every emergency law passed during crisis, every archive preserving records against forgetting. Across thousands of years, civilizations change languages, religions, technologies, and political systems. Yet the same ancient anxiety continues moving quietly beneath them all. What happens when order fails? The first laws emerge beside dangerous rivers, where early societies struggle to prevent revenge, famine, theft, and violence from tearing fragile communities apart. Kings carve decrees into stone because memory alone feels too weak. Priests invoke divine punishment because human witnesses cannot see everything. Empires expand legal systems across vast territories because strangers must somehow cooperate without killing one another constantly. And still, collapse keeps happening. This contradiction may be the deepest lesson hidden inside the history of ancient law. No civilization discovers permanent stability. Every legal system, no matter how sophisticated, eventually confronts forces it cannot fully control. Environmental disaster, economic inequality, corruption, war, political fragmentation, human ambition, fear itself. The laws endure longer than individuals, sometimes longer than empires, but never forever. What survives in the archaeological record reveals a pattern almost haunting in its consistency. Great civilizations rise believing they have finally secured lasting order. Monumental architecture projects permanence. Written codes proclaim justice. Administrative systems expand. Trade flourishes. Populations grow confident in structures that seem immovable. Then something shifts. Rain patterns change gradually over decades. Harvests weaken. Wealth concentrates dangerously. Officials exploit their positions. Armies become politically unstable. Trust erodes. Neighboring powers sense weakness. Local conflicts spread faster than institutions can contain them. And suddenly societies that once appeared eternal become fragile again. Ancient people understand this more clearly than modern societies often do. They live close enough to environmental uncertainty and political violence that permanence rarely feels guaranteed. Floods can erase entire harvests. Plagues can empty cities. Invaders can arrive within weeks. Dynasties collapse with alarming regularity. The line separating civilization from catastrophe remains visible. Perhaps this is why early legal systems are so emotionally intense. Law is never merely technical in the ancient world. It is existential. Kings do not simply administer societies. They claim to hold back chaos itself. Punishment is not merely corrective. It is symbolic reassurance that disorder has boundaries. Religious rituals surrounding justice attempt to anchor human systems within cosmic order, because earthly stability alone feels too fragile. And beneath all of it lies memory. Human beings remember violence deeply. Even when civilizations become prosperous, old fears survive culturally. Stories of floods, collapsing kingdoms, divine punishment, invasions, and ruined cities pass between generations. Ancient myths preserve psychological truths about instability regardless of whether every detail is historical. The world can become dangerous very quickly. Social order can disappear faster than expected. Modern societies often imagine themselves distant from such anxieties, protected by institutions more advanced than anything ancient civilizations possessed. Yet the underlying fears remain strikingly familiar. Governments still promise security against disorder. Legal systems still attempt balancing freedom with stability. Public debates still revolve around crime, corruption, inequality, migration, violence, and social fragmentation. The technologies are different. The emotional architecture is ancient. Even now, laws shape everyday life so completely that most people rarely notice their presence until systems fail. Property ownership, contracts, inheritance, marriage, punishment, taxation, commercial trust between strangers, bureaucratic records preserving identity and obligation. These structures descend through layers of historical evolution, reaching back toward the first river civilizations. And like ancient societies, modern civilizations also depend heavily on the invisible trust. People obey traffic systems expecting others to do the same. Banks function because populations trust records and institutions. Courts matter because citizens believe judgments carry legitimacy. Entire economies rely on strangers honoring contracts. Civilization remains, at its core, a network of shared expectations reinforced by law. Ancient rulers understood how fragile those expectations could become. This is why so many early legal systems appear obsessed with visibility. Public punishments, monumental inscriptions, ceremonial oaths, sacred authority. The law must feel real enough to overcome fear, greed, anger, and desperation. It must convince populations that order will survive even when individuals suffer injustice or uncertainty. Sometimes it succeeds for centuries. Sometimes it fails suddenly. No single explanation fully accounts for why some societies endure longer than others. Geography matters, climate matters, leadership matters, economic systems matter, luck matters too. Yet history repeatedly suggests that civilizations weaken when laws lose legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary people. Once populations stop believing systems are fair, predictable, or protective, fragmentation accelerates. Corruption spreads because collective trust disappears. Violence increases because institutional authority weakens. People retreat towards smaller loyalties, family, tribe, faction, ideology. The ancient world demonstrates this repeatedly across millennia. And yet humanity never stops rebuilding. This may be the most remarkable part of the story. After collapses, wars, plagues, and disasters, people return to ruined cities and begin reconstructing order again. They rewrite laws, restore canals, reopen markets, rebuild temples and archives, teach children the old stories alongside new rules. Civilization persists not because it becomes indestructible, but because human beings continue choosing reconstruction over permanent chaos. Again and again, the first laws were imperfect, unequal, and often brutal. They protected hierarchies as much as justice. They enforced obedience through fear as much as fairness. Yet they also represented something profoundly human. An attempt to resist disintegration, a refusal to surrender entirely to violence and unpredictability. Beside the rivers of Mesopotamia, beneath the gaze of gods carved into stone, humanity began writing down its desperate hope that order could survive memory, survival, ambition, and time itself. And in many ways, we're still living inside that experiment. The night settles slowly over the ruins. Wind moves through broken walls where courts once gathered and kings once proclaimed justice beneath banners now long vanished into dust. The canals that fed ancient cities have shifted course or dried away entirely. Temple stones lie scattered beneath open skies. Somewhere beneath the earth, buried tablets still wait in silence, preserving fragments of debts, marriages, punishments, harvests, and promises made by people who believed their world would continue forever. Most of them are forgotten now. Their empires disappeared. Their rulers became names carved into damaged stone. The laws that once governed every aspect of life survive only in fragments translated by scholars working under electric light thousands of years later. Yet the fears behind those laws remain strangely recognizable. The fear of violence spreading unchecked, the fear of hunger during failed harvests, the fear of corruption hollowing out institutions from within, the fear that civilization itself may be more fragile than it appears. Ancient people lived close to collapse. They saw cities burned, dynasties erased, rivers flood unpredictably, and entire populations displaced by war or drought. They understood something modern societies sometimes struggle to remember. Order is not natural. It must be maintained constantly through cooperation, memory, trust, and restraint. And even then, it may not last. But perhaps that is not the most important part of the story. Because despite everything, humanity keeps rebuilding. Again and again across thousands of years, people return after catastrophe and begin restoring structure to broken worlds. They mark boundaries, record agreements, gather in marketplaces, reopen roads, raise walls, rewrite laws, teach children which actions preserve trust and which destroy it. Civilization survives not through perfection, but through repetition, through countless ordinary acts of cooperation repeated across generations. The first lawmakers could not foresee modern nations, digital networks, or global cities lit through the night. They could not imagine courts operating across continents, or laws stored invisibly inside machines rather than carved into stone. Yet they would likely recognize the deeper instinct immediately, the desire to hold chaos at a distance. Somewhere tonight, rivers still move past crowded cities just as they did beside Ur and Babylon. Lights reflect across the water where ancient torchfire once flickered against mud brick walls. People sign contracts, argue over property, fear instability, trust strangers cautiously, and hope the systems around them will endure one more generation. And beneath all of it, almost unchanged across millennia, remains the same fragile human belief that tomorrow, despite everything history has already shown, order will hold,